I welcome everyone back to our continuing series of Zoom interviews. I'm David Richards, director of the Margaret Smith Library. I'm very pleased today to have Ryan Powers with us, who is the host and creator of something called the Almost Immortal History podcast. So Ryan, can you give us a little background on yourself?
Happy to. And David, it's wonderful to see you, and thanks so much for having me on today.
My pleasure. Thank you for agreeing.
Absolutely. So yes, I am the host and producer and creator of the Almost Immortal History podcast. And I guess by way of introduction, even before that, I should say that I am a born and raised Washingtonian, Northern Virginia specifically. I am a communications professional down here in the Washington area, and I am a father of two young boys and proud husband as well. And so this podcast for me is a passion and a labor of love that really sort of encapsulates everything that I have come to love about history and how I really spend my free time anyway. So it's something that I've enjoyed being able to create and bring to an audience to see if they will like it as well.
Where did the idea come from?
So as a born and raised Washingtonian, I won't say that I got bit with the history bug early, but what I did get to have was exposure to history that I viewed as living and breathing, right? When you're in the Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. area, that you're just connected to so many things. You're a drive away from Mount Vernon and Monticello and obviously Capitol Hill and the White House and just a short distance from Jamestown. So from the Revolution to the Civil War to more modern times, you're really so close to things. So whether it was school field trips or my parents taking me to things, history came alive for me. And it was something that was always fascinating, and I could see it and I could visualize it. So every time I took a history class or read a book about history, it was much easier for me to visualize and really kind of conceptualize what was going on in those stories. And so for me, it was always something that was very interesting and very alive. And so that's really what got me going. And then as a communications professional, it's a lot of fun for me to be able to take things that I'm reading, whether it's history books or other things, and turn them into compelling stories that not only others might want to listen to, but most importantly, I would want to listen to.
Mm-hmm. Growing up, did you have a favorite historical site?
I did. I vividly remember a fourth grade field trip to Jamestown, the settlement at Jamestown. And for me, I think that was the first one. The second one was up to Philadelphia, but there was something about going to the settlement at Jamestown and seeing something that was 400 years old, almost 400 years old at the time. And it was magical to me. It was like stepping back into a fairy tale or a book that you'd see a picture of, but you really, until you're standing there seeing it, it's really something else. And of course, everyone, all of the staff and everyone there that does such a wonderful job of bringing it back to life. It really was a magical experience for someone so young.
It's interesting. I have a somewhat similar experience in how I came to be a historian. I grew up in the Portsmouth, New Hampshire area, and we have a colonial settlement area called Strawberry Bank, which the interesting thing done there is they've saved buildings through the years. So it's not just one time period, it's a succession of time periods. I did an archaeology program when I was in the third grade, and that sort of was the beginning of the history bug for me. The other thing I remember when I was in graduate school, I was on a committee that was hiring a new professor. I remember one of the interviews, one of the candidates said that he decided he wanted to become a historian when his family went to Colonial Williamsburg. And I knew right there, that's the one we wanted to be our history professor.
Absolutely. Well, and isn't it so important that whatever teachers you have, whether it's your teachers in school or family and friends, if they teach what they love and they share what they love with others, especially young people, that rubs off in a way that is really incalculable, right? It's something that if you share what you love, there's a different level of energy and a different level of excitement, and others can't help but be drawn in by that energy and excitement. And they say, well, if this person who I respect really likes this, I want to take a look at it too. And at the very least, if they don't want to take a look at it right away, they're predisposed to having a positive opinion about it when they're exposed to it later.
How old are your boys?
They are 5 and 7, and they are every bit the 5 and 7-year-old active boys you would imagine.
Have you started introducing them to history?
I have, and they are big fans of the podcast. They get a kick out of the fact that they hear their daddy's voice coming through a radio or a speaker somewhere, and they keep looking for me even when I'm not there. But they are interested in it, and they'll have the same benefit I have since we live here in Northern Virginia still. So.
Are they old enough to appreciate historic sites yet?
I don't know if they're old enough to appreciate historic sites, although we're going to try once we get through the pandemic. I think what they have noticed is I was actually thrilled one day when my youngest, now 5, was about 2, and I had a coffee mug from Mount Vernon that I drink out of. So I've got George Washington on a coffee mug, and without ever talking to him about it, he was less than 2, and he looked at my coffee mug one morning and he said, "Daddy, that's George Washington." I thought, okay, well, we're off and running.
Very good. So the way we came to know about you is through your podcast, and the very first subject that you picked for your podcast was Margaret Chase Smith.
Yes.
How did that come to be?
So I got very interested years ago in the concept that history had immortalized the villain and not the hero. There are so many books and stories and bits of information about Joe McCarthy and McCarthyism and the effects of McCarthyism and pulling that through to modern times. But Margaret Chase Smith's story wasn't as well known. And I just found that fascinating, because normally, and obviously infamy can do that, but we typically remember the heroes as well. And so that was sort of the kernel of what got me interested in, especially thinking about it in the Almost Immortal History podcast concept. But as I started to dig into her story, it wasn't just that we had forgotten the hero, and it wasn't just any old hero, right? It wasn't just some person. It was the only woman in the United States Senate, and she was a pioneer, and she was a maverick, and she had done so many things that had she never done what she did with the Declaration of Conscience, she still would be well worth everyone knowing, learning from, and hoping to emulate today. But the fact that she did what she did June 1st, 1950, just puts, in my mind, her into a different stratosphere of it's almost incomprehensible why she is not more widely known.
And are you aware that there's a new biography of Joe McCarthy out?
I am Larry Tye's biography. Yes, I can't wait to read it, because actually, in an interesting aside, my next character, Satchel Paige, after Margaret Chase Smith, I always have a few secondary biographies that kind of get me going on the subject before I dive into primary sources. And Larry Tye's was the one that I grabbed on Satchel Paige, and so I was very much marinating in Larry Tye's telling of a story, and then had no idea he was putting out the Joe McCarthy book. So I thought that was terrific.
It's purely coincidence that your first 2 topics wind out being things that he's done, biographies that touched upon.
For years, yeah, a complete coincidence. So I can't wait to meet him.
Well, we just received our copy of the McCarthy biography yesterday.
Oh, great.
I was just flipping through it to see how Margaret comes out. It's over 300 pages, and there's probably maybe 10 pages that refer to Margaret Chase Smith.
Well, and that's what I found in the Joe McCarthy books too, which was, and everyone, and of course everyone's going to have a different take and a different viewpoint on it. But it is, to your point, it's still interesting that a topic like that, 10 pages, and of course, he had a life to tell that you can fill 400, 500, 600 pages. Yeah. But it is interesting to see that she is often footnoted in major biographies like that, which really shouldn't be the case.
So I'm grasping now that there is meaning in the almost immortal. So it's the idea that she hasn't become immortalized. She was almost immortalized, and that's sort of your role, is to try to get her over that next hump.
That's it. The concept
Okay.
of almost immortal. I latched onto that phrase a few years ago, and not even in the concept of this podcast or this idea, but I really got fascinated as you think about history and who, they say, history is told by the winners, and that's true for the most part, but even so to this day, and I know we have, there are statistics about declining knowledge about history and what have you. But really, who do we immortalize today, and who has made that pantheon, and what qualifies for that? And that's a subjective opinion, of course, but I think the concept of almost immortal, what I really started to latch onto was a lot of these folks, it's not as if you've never heard of them or no one's ever heard of them. In fact, the reason why it's not called Almost Famous, aside from the fact that that was a movie, is that they were famous. For the most part, these folks were incredibly famous. Margaret Smith was the number 4 most respected woman in the world in the Gallup poll in the 50s, and covers of Newsweek and on and on. Rumored to be a potential vice president in 1952. I mean, she really was someone who was quite famous and quite popular in her time. So those are the individuals that fascinate me the most, which is, how did they go from being such a big deal in their time to not as well known? And it's not to say that they're not known today, because I think a lot of people might say, oh, sure, Margaret Smith, I've heard that name. Why do I know that? But if you're outside of the state of Maine or New England, you start to see less and less name recognition. And certainly, yes, I know the name, but why do I know that name? And what was her story? And why is that important, not just for me, but for all of us? So Almost Immortal is the way to sort of bring those individuals back. It's the tagline is Famous Figures, Forgotten Stories, a history podcast that brings them back.
Mm-hmm. And I was noticing that one of the other things that you emphasized in your introduction, that's on your website, it's also about storytelling for you. And you have a communications background. So can you talk more about that?
Absolutely. Well, as we talk about history, there's really 2 camps, right? There are people who love history, and people who will say they don't like history or aren't sure they like history. And I've always smiled at that, because I think back to the way I grew up and you grew up, and it's more likely than not your exposure to history or what you view as history. And so when you move away from the topic of the binary choice of do you like history or don't you like history, I think the better way to phrase it is, do you like a good story? Yeah. Because even people who say they don't like history at all, you'll go to a movie with, and whether that movie is sitting in your living room watching Band of Brothers or John Adams' HBO, or going to the movies and seeing Harriet Tubman or whatever it is, anyone will come out of those stories or shows and say, wow, I wish I would have learned about that sooner. I can't believe I didn't know about it. What an amazing story. And it's not musty history or whatever negative or pejorative they would assign to it. It's stories about some of the most fascinating people who ever lived, and some of the most fascinating events. And everyone is interested in a good story. Every magazine on the shelf and most modern books today are all about people and individuals. And so the storytelling is how you bring to life things that, if you like history, you're going to like the story. But if you think you don't like history, you're still going to want to hear a fascinating story. And that's what we're finding, of course, with the podcast, which is we're trying to take something and saying, we do want to prompt you to go learn more about these people. We would love for you to read a biography or go learn more on your own about these individuals. But at a minimum, why don't you hear in short story form, whether it's in 25 minutes or 30-minute increments, about this individual, and in a way that might captivate you to want to learn more about them.
My reminder that it's all about storytelling was just having seen Hamilton.
Hamilton is, and what's so wonderful, I actually was just watching the Disney Plus original cast version the other night with my family, and we were lucky enough to see it a couple of years ago live here at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. And what Lin-Miranda was able to do, the words genius and Shakespeare and, as high a praise as you can heap on him, I think they're all deserved, because to be able to take something, I think, what was the story when when Lin Miranda visited the White House and told President Obama, then President Obama, that he was going to do a musical on Alexander Hamilton, and Obama said, "Well, good luck with that." And because you wouldn't think, boy, how does that translate? But to be able to take a modern interpretation and say, it's not just about the story that happened 250 years ago. That story has resonance today. And it's not about, were these, what was the color of their skin, or what was the setting, or what. You can take this and say, this story has resonance today, and it's an American story, it's a human story, and it will resonate with everyone if told in a way that is compelling. And boy, did he hit that one out of the park.
So what resonance do you think Margaret Chase Smith still has?
Well, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? I think that to take someone like a Margaret Chase Smith, the more I dove into her story, it's impossible not to be impressed with her earnestness and her ambition, but ambition for noble reasons. She didn't seek fame or fortune. She was ambitious because every time she was presented with a new opportunity, she just knew she could do a good job. Maybe she thought she could do the best job, but she certainly thought she could do a good job and represent herself and her constituents and her country in an admirable way. And she did every single time. Every single step along the way, she did it with dignity and honor. And so to have a public servant, and again, it doesn't matter what political party you hail from or what your perspectives are, I think we should all want that from our leaders, whether in public office or business or on and on, to have someone like a Margaret Chase Smith who looks at the country and the world and people as earnestly and honestly as she did, and had that dose of conscience. She stood up and gave the Declaration of Conscience in 1950, but her whole career was a mark of her conscience. And we were lucky to have that conscience, whether you agreed with her perspective or not. I was drawn to the fact that even outside of the Declaration, she seemed to be uncannily on the right side of history on just about everything she chose to go against her party on, or just what she decided to weigh in on, whether it was FDR's pre-World War II initiatives, whether it was Lend-Lease or other things, NATO, the Marshall Plan, and even getting into the space race. I really enjoyed reading her comments in the early 60s. She was very clearly talking about, and others did at NASA as well, but the space race, of course, wasn't just important for the obvious reasons of the moment, but she was already starting to give word and voice in the early 60s to, if all we do is create this fantastic technology that will bring on for future generations all of these different advances and innovations. And she very clearly is talking about the technological advances of today, the internet, satellite technology. You can see it 60 years ago. It was fascinating that she was on the right side of history and had that clairvoyance and an ability to say, this is the right thing for my constituents in Maine, this is the right thing for the American people, and this is the right thing for individuals all over the world. And she just always had a knack for being on the right side of that. So, of course, who wouldn't want more Margaret Chase Smith in the world?
You've dived very deeply into Margaret Chase Smith. It's more, your knowledge is more than just the Declaration of Conscience. How did you come to learn so much about Margaret Chase Smith?
Sure. So I had a few secondary sources that I got started with, and then started to look into primaries. But I will say that the Margaret Chase Smith Library, your staff, specifically Angie Stockwell and others, were so gracious with their time and their knowledge, especially in the middle of a pandemic. I just can't thank you and the staff enough for your willingness to share things that are in your collections. And so it was a joy and a pleasure. And it's not just that you and the staff do such amazing work in keeping alive and promoting Margaret Chase Smith and how important she is to know, but the fact that you were part of her lives, and this isn't 200 years ago. This is someone that you knew, and so there's an extra level of meaning that I think that empowers all of you and emboldens all of you to carry on and promote a legacy of a person that you have direct connection to. So it was very special for me to be able to work with you and to be able to take in all of the different resources and things that are out there, and be able to sort of form my own story around it.
Well, just to know that you picked up on her views during World War II, because a lot of people look at her as being a creation of men, either following in behind her husband, Clyde. But Clyde was very much in the isolationist tradition. So there's her staking out her own beliefs. And then a lot of people don't know about the impact and role she had in the space program. So you obviously picked up on that as well. And another thing that is even lesser known, which has been interesting to discover, she was a very strong supporter of a federal role in medical research as well, which is something that's come up as people have asked us, what would Margaret think about the pandemic? But very early on, she felt the federal government needed to be investing more into medical research.
Absolutely. I marvel at her omniscience and her ability to, obviously she's not perfect and no one in history is perfect. And I think we do all of the people that we talk about and learn about in history a disservice when we think of them as perfect, or why didn't they have the clairvoyance that we have today with the X amount of years that have passed to know, what we know now then. But even given that caveat, her point of view and perspective on most things was pretty spot on then and now. So she's an impressive person, to be sure.
Well, we're very pleased that she became your first selection for Almost Immortal History.
Well, it's been a real honor, and I'll tell you, as I thought about the podcast and thought about the myriad people that I could and now will talk about, and I have a list of 20 to 30 deep, and they can be reordered and what have you. Margaret Chase Smith was always on the short list. Okay. I was absolutely going to pick her, and she was pretty much on the short list to be number one the whole time. I don't think I ever thought, well, it might be her, or it might be someone else. I just thought she would be a terrific person to launch the podcast with. And of course, however many episodes we do, she will always be the first one. And I'm so proud that she will be, because I think she represents, I was about to say immortalized, but not to keep using that phrase. I think she just represents what this podcast and this effort is really all about, because of all the stories that everyone ought to know about, she ought to be at the top of everyone's list.
So we've talked a lot about it. How can people access it?
Yes. So you can do a number of things. The podcast is available wherever you might listen to your podcast, whether that's Apple Podcast or Google or Spotify, and on and on. But you can also go to our website at www.almostimmortal.com. And there are also social media channels on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter that have all of the different information as well. Because part of the goal of the Almost Immortal History podcast is we don't want to just tell the story of this fascinating person, and we're trying to do about one a month, but it might end up being, It might take a little bit longer over time. But one of the things that I really want to do personally is I don't want to just tell the story of Margaret Chase Smith and then never go back to her ever again. In my mind, social media is such a powerful storytelling mechanism and ability to reach a broad audience that I really want to be part of the Margaret Chase Smith storytelling business forevermore. And so as we add individuals to the Almost Immortal History podcast portfolio, they will all become part of the tapestry and the story. But I want to be able to make sure that we keep Margaret Chase Smith, her story and her accomplishments well known to as broad an audience as possible going forward.
Well, when we post this interview, we'll also make sure to post another link on our Facebook page so that through that way people can see what it was actually 2 parts, right?
It was two parts. Yeah, I when I first started, I had made the promise in my intro episode that I would try to keep the podcast to under 30 minutes, because I just feel like that might be a good window of time for people to consume something. And I said I might go over 30 minutes. And of course, I think I've set myself up for the fact that it's almost it's very difficult to contain it even to 2 episodes. But I think for the most part, these are going to be hour-long, broken into 2 30-minute episodes.
Mm-hmm. Subject number 2 was Satchel Paige, which you alluded to. I assume you're working on biography number 3?
Working on story number 3, and Satchel Paige, I did very intentionally pick Satchel Paige after Margaret Chase Smith for a variety of reasons, not because they had commonality, but specifically because they didn't. And even though they were sort of in the same time frame, I wanted to be clear that this isn't a podcast about members of Congress or politicians only, or the 20th century, which now we're going back in the 3rd episode and making sure we're not doing just the 20th century.
Okay.
So the Almost Immortal History podcast is about political figures and military generals and scientists and artists and innovators and 17th century, 18th, 19th, 20th, on and on. And it's not just a US-based podcast, it will be global, because the stories are endless. And there's no lack of fascinating stories out there for so many different audiences. And my hope is over time, there may be a specific audience that is interested in Margaret Chase Smith, and then another one that's interested in Satchel Paige. But over time, as you start to see the group of individuals that's assembled, you say, this is a podcast about stories, about fascinating people, and they're all fascinating, whether you thought you wanted to learn about them or not. So Satchel Paige was a fantastic story. And really, when I started, I did not mean, I didn't even know that it was the 100th anniversary of the Negro Leagues this year. And Major League Baseball will be honoring that this weekend. That actually was not, that didn't factor into my calculus, but it's good timing nonetheless. But I think to be able to have those two start things off was a nice starter. And then to your point, yes, currently writing Dr. Benjamin Rush as my 3rd one. So we're going back to the Founding Fathers. Yeah. And certainly fascinated by Benjamin Rush because, of course, we know about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and will continue to, as we should. But here is someone who not only was friends with all of them, they were his patients. This was a medical doctor who just so happened to be involved in just about everything that was critically important around the founding. And I think people will be fascinated to learn that he wasn't just a passive bystander. He was actively involved in so many things that people will have no idea about.
Your training is in communication. You're doing this podcast. Are there other ways that you have used your communication training?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as a communications professional, I think the 2 things that I've always enjoyed doing most are writing and speaking. And so I've been very fortunate in my career, whether it's private sector organizations or nonprofits, to be able to exercise both. I am in a constant state of creating written and oral communication, and being able to speak on behalf of the organizations themselves, the issues that that matter to them, and do that in written form and verbally. And of course, now with the advent over the last several decades of social media, adding in the digital component as well. So to me, it's fascinating. It was fascinating 30 years ago studying it, and it's fascinating now to see how it has evolved. Some would say for the better, some would say for the worse, and I'm sure the answer is both, right? But you just sort of evolve. How do people consume information now? What's the most effective way to get that to them?
I have a question that I'm wondering about. That is, if you had a chance to interview Margaret Chase Smith, what would you want to ask her? Oh
boy, how long would we have?
I know it's not a good one to dump on you with 5 minutes left to go, but just
no. I just mean, how long would I get her?
The idea is, I mean, you've obviously learned a lot about her.
Yes.
But what haven't you been able to find in the primary or secondary sources that you want to be able to ask her directly?
Absolutely.
Gaps. What gaps you feel there are?
I don't know that I would ask about as many gaps, as much as I just think there's so many moments in her career and her life that you'd want to be a fly on the wall for. And one of them, I mean, of course, being on the floor when she gave the Declaration of Conscience would be at the top of most people's list. But I really was fascinated with the moments like just before that, when she is clearly, as any of us who've had to give a public speech know, the butterflies in your stomach and your head swirling, especially one of such magnitude and such importance and in such a public atmosphere, and one that she knew was going to draw such retribution from someone who would be more than happy to deliver that retribution in myriad ways. To have all of that in your head and come out of your office in the Capitol and get ready to take the subway over to the Capitol building to deliver this speech, and your mind is racing, and you're standing there waiting for the Senate subway, and who should show up in that one moment but Joe McCarthy himself to ride the subway over with you. I just thought, something like that, you'd love to just say, what were you thinking in that moment when that happened? Because that's just, you wouldn't believe that if you saw it in a movie. They'd say, well, that's just too picture perfect. They wrote that one in just just to make it a perfect movie. I think there's moments like that. I think that with Clyde Smith passing away and taking office for the first time in the Capitol, what was that like in the House of Representatives for her for the first time? And then as soon as she took over, we're in World War II, right? I mean, all of the momentous things that happened to her right away. It's not as if she got some long training period or got to have smooth sailing for 20 years until she was challenged. I mean, she was thrown into the deep end of the pool right off the bat. What must that have been like? And then to the point of the space race, right? What was it like to now? And she obviously got to see the fruits of the labor, not just with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins in the moon landing, but for years after that. And so going back to
the years before too. I mean, she's there at the beginning, Project Mercury,
in the late
Project
50s.
Gemini, Project Apollo, and even the beginnings of the space shuttle program as well.
Right. And I think that would be one of the fascinating questions, is in the late 50s, when you're there with Lyndon Johnson and everyone else, what was that like? What did you know then, or what did you think then that in hindsight may seem more obvious or fait accompli to many, but to you, what was that like at the outset, in the first couple of days? That must have just been fascinating, because she seemed to have a grasp of, it wasn't just, oh, sure, I'll sit on this committee and see where it goes. I think she had a very clear understanding that this was important. This was going to be something.
Well, Ryan, you're a very effective communicator, and we've packed a lot in. It's already over 30 minutes. So let me give you a chance to plug one more time your podcast.
Happy to. So it is the Almost Immortal History podcast. You can find it anywhere where you can download a podcast, or you can go to www.almostimmortal.com.
And do you have a sense when the third topic will drop?
Yes, it will be out within the next month. It will either be late August or early September, but it is being written as we speak.
Okay. So I know we've been getting emails, but if people sign up, will they get emails letting them know when your next podcast is ready?
Yes, absolutely. So on the almostimmortal.com site, you can sign up on email, and you will be the first to know when the next episode is going to drop. And as we start to build up an audience that way, I think there are some other things we can do to pay you off. I'm not interested in the email spam business, but I am interested in rewarding anyone who's part of the email list with some things that they'll know before the general public. So more to come. But yes, please go and sign up, and happy to communicate with you that way.
Well, I've listened to all 4 of your podcasts now, because each of them have had 2. Each of the topics have had 2 sections to them, and I find they're a wonderful way to have lunch. Have lunch and listen to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much.
So I look forward to your next one.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate the time. And again, I just can't thank the Margaret Chase Smith Library enough. You all have been terrific. And obviously you're doing wonderful work for so many, but for me specifically, it's been an honor and a privilege to work with you so far. And as I say, I have no intention of this being the end of our relationship. I look
Well,
forward to doing whatever I can to help you, the library, and Margaret Chase Smith forevermore.
thank you very much. And for one thing, we need to make sure that you have the chance to come and visit the Margaret Chase Smith Library when we can reopen to the public again.
I can't wait.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Bye-bye.
Bye.